Hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're gonna, if everyone could take their seats, we're gonna kick off. Thank you so much for joining us here today for our event on nature-based solutions, biodiversity's vital role in building resilience and enabling mitigation. We've got a splendid panel here today, and we're going to be diving into what nature-based solutions look like, what they should look like, and how they could be implemented in a rights-based approach with biodiversity at the center. We're going to dive straight into introductions from our wonderful panel. So we'll just do a couple of minutes for each of you to do some quick introductions about yourself. And then we will move into some short presentations, followed by a panel discussion. So if you guys have questions, please hold them on to the end, because we've got a good 20 minutes for audience questions. So to introduce, here we are. So here is our panel for today. I'll kick off with me. I'm going to be chairing this meeting. My name is Bethan Lachlan. I'm the Senior Policy Specialist from the Zoological Society of London. We are an international conservation organisation that's been in operation for just under 200 years. We're going to have our 200th anniversary very soon. And we work worldwide on conservation of all types and do a lot of work on nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches. We're also joined by Professor Nathalie Seddon, Professor Alex Antonelli, Oluwaseun Agboge, Dr. Tony Juniper, and Abraham Burgay. So I like it when panelists are able to introduce themselves. So I'm going to give you the chance to introduce yourselves a couple of minutes. So please, let's go in order. Alex, if you want to kick, sorry, Nathalie, if you want to kick us off.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's great, thanks. I'm Nathalie Seddon. I'm a professor of biodiversity at the University of Oxford, based out of both the departments of biology and geography. I'm also founding director of something called the Naturebased Solutions Initiative, which was established in 2017, and we do research, education and policy advice on nature-based solutions and trying to shore up the evidence for their social and ecological resilience and economic value. I also sit on the Adaptation Committee of the UK Climate Change Committee. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Alex?
So hi everyone. I'm sure you must be really tired after all those days, but it's really fantastic to be here. I'm Alex Antonelli. I'm a professor of biodiversity as well. I was born and grew up in Brazil. I'm the director of science at the Urban Gareth Q. And Q, together with ZSL and Natural History Museum, we are building this biodiversity alliance, so to work together in terms of a unified voice in the London region when it comes to biodiversity. I have some other different hats as well. I'm a visiting professor in Oxford and at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I also started a big project in the Brazilian Atlantic rainforest to conserve and restore some of our wonderful forests there, which are very degraded. I'll stop here.
All right, everyone. My name is Sori. Okay, it's been a long time at COP. All right, so my name is Oluwaseun Adekugbe. I'm from Nigeria, and I am representing Youth for Nature, which is a global youth-led organization, and we work in the intersection of nature and climate, and we work through storytelling, knowledge sharing, and capacity building, and trying to address this, these challenges of resources, of knowledge, of capacity that hinder young people in interacting in this kind of space.
Tony?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tony Juniper, and I'm the chairman of Natural England, which is the British government's nature recovery and conservation agency in England. We are a regulator. We are a science organisation that advises in relation to policy, and we are a delivery agency on various government policies, for example, in relation to agriculture and how we can align farming with nature recovery. I'm also a fellow with the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and I spent many years working with NGOs, including being the director of Friends of the Earth in England for a long time, working with WWF for a period, and I also had the pleasure of being an advisor to the Prince of Wales for 10 years, now King Charles, on ecological subjects, and I have to say he gave the best speech here so far over these 2 weeks. Thank you.
Finally, Abraham.
Hello everyone, my name is Abraham Bugri. I'm a researcher and advocate working on the intersection of climate, nature and disaster risk reduction. I've had the opportunity to work with amazing young people like these guys from Youth for Nature as we develop this amazing document, which we'll probably touch more on, which is the Global Youth Position Statement on Nature-Based Solutions. I'm also a researcher at the Gender, Environment, and Social Inequity Lab at the University of Regina in Canada. So that's kind of the work I do. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. So this event has been brought together between Youth for Nature, the Zoological Society of London, the Natural History Museum, and Kew Gardens. And we wanted to bring a panel together that was interdisciplinary, intergenerational, and from a variety of locations in order to talk about this topic of nature-based solutions, which is, as you will have noticed, cropping up an awful lot across COP. But there's also a number of questions around how do we do nature-based solutions properly? How are we ensuring that they're biodiversity rich, that they are bringing with them benefits for people and communities and respecting the rights of local people? So this discussion is going to cover that. We are going to kick off with a couple of 5-minute rapid presentations, no slides, just listening from experts around what nature-based solutions is, how we can understand it. So we're going to kick off with Nathalie, then to Alex, and finally to the folks at Youth for Nature. So Nathalie, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we thought it would be good to maybe start off with some definitions. Just first of all, let's start with biodiversity. So we know that biodiversity has been officially defined, but based on science, as the diversity of life from the level of the gene to the level of the ecosystem. And that includes interactions within and between species and the habitats they live in. It's a property of the natural world. So, and this is sometimes overlooked. Sometimes it is conflated with the term wildlife, or a polar bear, or a panda, or an iconic wildlife, species of wildlife that might drive, a conservation movement. But actually, biodiversity is a property of nature, and it is a very, very important property of nature. It is that which secures the flow of all the many benefits that humanity get from nature as part of nature. There are no, the flow of ecosystem services, or as we're increasingly referring to them as the flat flow of nature's contributions to people, is secured by biodiversity. The more biodiverse an ecosystem, or the closer that ecosystem is to having natural or pre-human levels of biodiversity, the more able it is to do its core ecological functions, whether that's nutrient cycling or basic photosynthesis, or all the many different ecological processes that ecosystems do. They need biodiversity. It's a foundation of resilience, and there's a lot of experimental studies from all over the world in lots of different ecosystems really showing a very clear relationship. You increase the numbers of species or different measures of biodiversity, and you increase its ability to deal with shock and change. So you increase its ability to deal with droughts or floods or fires. You're more likely to recover those ecological processes if that ecosystem is diverse. And there's lots of experimental and observational work from all over the world that really, really bolsters that statement. So it's a foundational property of nature. And so it is a foundational property from nature-based solution, of a nature-based solution. And nature-based solutions have been formally defined by UNEA last year. A multilateral definition has been agreed. It's quite a long definition, but we have a short version, which I think is quite useful to bear in mind, that it involves actions that involve working with nature as part of nature to address societal challenge or challenges, and that might be food security, water security, climate change adaptation, maybe climate change mitigation, in a way that brings benefits to biodiversity and people locally. And those local benefits for people and biodiversity are incredibly important, because they are that which ensures that those solutions from nature can continue to flow, especially in a warming world. And I'm sure these issues will be touched upon. So biodiversity is a foundational property of a nature-based solution. Therefore, the focus in many communities on carbon and net zero, and the conflation of nature-based solutions with cheap offsets and commercial forestry, is deeply problematic. And I think it's really, really important to recognize that nature-based solutions is a term, it's a holistic term, an umbrella term. And if those interventions, do not benefit biodiversity, if they involve land grabs, then those interventions are not a nature-based solutions according to this multilaterally agreed definition of what a nature-based solution is. So I think that's really important, and there's been a lot of confusion about this. Now, alongside biodiversity, an element of it, in fact, is connectivity. So I think it's really important. There's lots of evidence really based on intuition as well as science and, very importantly, traditional knowledge, that not only do ecosystems or nature-based solutions need to be biodiverse, but they need to be connected across our whole scape. So we need to be thinking about landscapes and how different ecosystems interact with each other. There's little point in investing a lot of funding into, say, protecting our coastal ecosystems if agricultural practices produce runoff, nitrogen runoff or whatever it might be, that then basically undermines the health and integrity of that. So we need to be thinking of those land-sea interactions and interactions among ecosystems within them. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, Alex, if you'd like to take over and sort of give a bit of insight from your perspective at Key.
Yeah, so sure. I think when many people talk about nature-based solutions, one of the key things people think about is forests. So I just want to pick on one of those that everyone's talking about, because we are at a climate conference and forests are going to save the world, right? Well, I mean, I think we need to bring some nuance to that. And the first thing I'd like to say is that forests are not just a bunch of trees. Forests are so much more than that. And trees themselves, it's the interconnectedness of lots and lots of different species from different groups. It's about all the birds and the fungi and the mosses and the lichens and the bryophytes, the mycorrhizae that exist within the soil and actually hold a huge amount of carbon, so not only above ground. So we need to understand that natural element of how forests evolve, how they are maintained over time, and what kind of benefits we can derive from them. Carbon is just a fraction of that. It's an important one because we are really struggling to keep our planet worth living and the carbon kept in those forests, but it's just so much more than that. I was born and grew up in Brazil. My relatives really struggle to get clean water because every time you cut down the forests, you expose land and soils to those terrible weather events where there are landslides killing hundreds of people every year in the region where my family comes from. We don't have access to clean water, and it's also about not only the global but the local climate mitigation effects, because if you have a forest nearby, and we all know that when it's really hot in the summers now, if you can go to a place where there's a bit of water, a bit of forest, there's a very drastic improvement in terms of the climatic conditions. It's cooler, it's much more pleasant for us to be in. And we at Q are working more than 100 countries. So we are now about 700 scientists. We are working with countries where they don't have the luxury of going to a building with air conditioning. And I think that nature is really not only a question about luxury, it's a question about survival. And forests are key elements of what we're trying to do now in terms of tackling the climate and biodiversity emergency, because we know that a high proportion of the species that are threatened live in forests. So we now estimate that about 1 million species are threatened to go extinct, and we at Q have estimated that about 45% of all plant species are likely to go extinct. And we have estimates from ZSL for animals as well. So it's a really bad picture when it comes to biodiversity. And the great thing here is that forests, as a key nature-based solution, is an element that can help us tackle the climate crisis. It can bring back some of the amazing diversity that is really threatened now, and also bring huge benefits to people. And a key element here is restoration, and bringing back those forests that have gone, and using methods which are based on the best available science. So at Q, together with partners from the Botanical Gardens Conservation International and others, we've developed a set of 10 golden rules for successful reforestation, based on very simple but science-based principles, such as using native species, not planting trees where they shouldn't be because of natural conditions, looking at the provenance of those seeds, and so forth, so that we know that forests that are brought back now are actually going to survive in the longer term in a warmer and more unpredictable climate. And those guidelines are much better to focus on than trying to increase the number of trees that people are planting, because some say, oh, plant 1 million trees and 1 billion trees, 1 trillion trees. We really have to get it right. And I don't think we can afford making mistakes now and having to regret. But the first thing is actually not to only work on restoration, but to conserve what we've got. And it is very painful as a Brazilian to see that we are still losing about 1 million hectares of forest every single year. It's not a phenomenon that is conspicuous to Brazil. Many other countries are still seeing unacceptable deforestation rate. So we have to collectively work with finances, with the mechanisms to avoid deforestation, so that we don't only talk about restoration, but also protection, because those two measures, in combination with sustainable use of natural resources in forests, are going to be absolutely fundamental and critical for us to reach the nature and climate goals that we have as societies. I think I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, and Youth for Nature, if you'd like to come in and give us some insight into sort of what you're seeing with implementation on the ground and the experience from a young people's perspective. So over to you, Oluwaseun.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm going to pick a point from what you mentioned, Alex, which is about survivor. At Youth for Nature, for instance, we recognize that the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis are overlapping and intersecting crises, and we cannot address one and leave the other, because these are crises that have evolved from the same systems. And one of the things that I've seen, particularly, we've been following the UN CBD COP, and also we've been following the UNFCCC for a while now as Youth for Nature. And then we recognize that, yes, there should be this, like separate conferences that really talk about all of these crises, but we also want to see the intersection of this, how connected these crises are and are being managed together. And I was also speaking about this, that nature is the baseline for which community operates and even economy operates, and it's a matter of survival. So we are not showing up for nature just to look good or for branding, but we are showing up for nature because it's a means of survival. For instance, if you take a look at Africa, where majority will depend on agriculture, and then this is a very climate sensitive sector. But if you look at a lot of the just transition that we are talking about right now, many of the materials and minerals that people are talking about when they talk about just transition is going to evolve from nature. And this nature is something that we have not really dived into to really see how we are going to properly, all the right mechanisms are in place to implement all the solutions that we are listening. So it's a thing of survival. I just want to mention that we are very clear that we cannot even get to the limitation of, to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees without nature. I would quickly, before I give us this evidence that we want to talk about, which is how Youth for Nature as an organization were able to move from policy to implementation of nature-based solutions on the ground. We have this clear message also that we have to recognize nature is everything and is deserving of rights in every decision making, but especially recognizing the safeguarding of biodiversity integrity when we are making these plans on nature-based solutions, and upholding the rights and autonomy and leadership of local communities and indigenous people. This is very important because behind every nature topic and every nature-based solutions that we hear about, there are real people that have been impacted or have been affected. There are real communities that are actually going to be in the forefront and in the receiving end of every decision we make. And so at Youth for Nature, which you also mentioned, we worked in the start of these nature-based solutions, we look into what is actually needed as young people to show up in this space as an organization that work in the intersection. And then we developed with Gibbon, and then Yongo, and of course, one of Gibbon representative and Yongo is here, which is a Global Youth Position Statement on Nature-Based Solutions, which was launched at COP26 in Glasgow. And then you can see here, we asked a lot of young people on what they want to see in the implementation of nature-based solutions. How do they perceive nature-based solutions? And you will be amazed that many of the challenges that young people have come together to highlight is still very relevant right now and is still being discussed without really a proper solution to many of them. So probably, yeah, we are visionaries, and we've seen from the start what is going to happen. And I think we will get back to the key messages later. And as an organization also, we in this development of the Global Youth Position Statement, there's something that is very relevant, is that nature-based solutions, for instance, is a new term for an old approach or old practice. It's not something new. It's something that communities have been leading on, communities have been developing, but now we have a new term for it and that we are using, and that term is very, very subjective to greenwashing and can be, if not properly implemented with structural framework, very strong mechanisms that will guide the implementation of nature-based solution, it can result in just the complete opposite of what we want it to be. And we can see that right now is happening. And so what we also did was to see as an organization that is working in this intersection to say we don't want to stop in that policy space alone, but we want to see what is actually happening with the implementation of nature-based solutions that we want to carry out in nature-based solution accelerator project, and just see what it means to actually have a project on the ground running. And so we have this accelerator project, and I don't know, Rachel, if you can pass the card around where you can actually scan the QR code to learn about the project. This is a project that is led by communities and is basically based on restoring degraded landscape, not setting up new forests, no. It is about restoring degraded landscape in Kenya. So we work with community groups who are already doing something they've seen the rate of degradation that is happening in their localities and different ecosystems, and they wanted to restore it. And so we work with them, and we brought them to the scene to be the one to design and implement the project they want to see in their communities. And I can tell you that I won't have the time to present all of this project to you, but we can tell you from what we've learned so far that it has been a success, and we've understand that this bottom-up approach, allowing communities to actually do what is meaningful to them and their environment, because they have been the ones safeguarding this environment, they have been the ones to know more about this environment, has brought to us a very tangible result, and I think we will discuss more as we go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was a lovely introduction down from the theory, which of course is paramount, through to the implementation. And it's interesting because for those of us who've been following the negotiations and outside of the negotiations, you'll notice that yesterday we had an entire day about nature. There were pledges and statements and events galore, but the question of if that's being translated into the negotiations, I think at the moment it's very much not. We're having to fight for language to be included on nature in the negotiations. It's not easy. And a lot of countries and parties are pushing against it. So it's really interesting that we've got this beautiful, impressive, amazing narrative that we should keep pushing for outside of the negotiations. There's a big question about how we get it in, and then also how that is enabling on the ground projects like what Youth for Nature is doing around getting finance into the hands of the people who need it. So with that, we're going to move into some questions to the panel. And I want to kick us off with a question to everybody. I think this has been hinted at in a few of the questions, but in the case studies and the thoughts we've just heard, it's clear that nature-based solutions have the possibility to bring real benefits to people and real benefits to the planet and mitigation, adaptation, all of those big buzzwords. But we're also seeing really, really big barriers that people are facing in implementing nature-based solutions, and ones that are good. So, an opening question to the panel. I'm gonna go through all of you, ask you to sort of give a minute or so of your thought of what do you think are those core barriers, just some thoughts on the core barriers and any ideas you have around that. So, I won't dictate. If you guys, whoever wants to go first. Tony?
There we go.
Tony?
Yeah. So I think this is the key question, because it's not for want of evidence or good thinking as to why nature-based solutions are an essential part of what we must embrace, and not just in relation to climate change, but also in relation to food and water security and also public health. There's every good reason why we should be doing this. But, you know, if you look back at the recent history of all of these subjects and, you know, thinking of global treaties and agreements and all the work that's been done to lobby language in, even when we get good language, we're still going in the opposite direction. And so the New York Declaration on Forests, mentioning the Amazon, Alex, you know, and what's been going on in South America and Central Africa, since the New York Declaration on Forests said we should be reducing deforestation to 0 by 2030, halving it by 2020, starting with the 2014 baseline, the deforestation rate went up by a very significant margin. So it's not for words in international agreements that we're lacking. There's something much more fundamental going on with this. And I think it's very important for practitioners on this subject to try and understand those barriers. And I've just been sitting here thinking, okay, if I was asked what are the things that are really stopping us, so let me give you number one, is the culture in policy making to go to technology and engineering first. People don't think nature. They think, in relation to flooding, let's build a concrete wall. They don't think about reforesting the hillside or renaturalising the floodplain. They think about things we can do with steel and cement. That's the first one. The second one is who run things. You know, in key decisions being taken in ministries across the world, it is people trained in economics, in finance, in engineering. There are very few ecologists who are in positions of serious decision making. How many prime ministers and presidents or heads of finance ministries have an ecology training? I can't think of any, and I think this is problematic. A third thing which lies behind both of those is the extent to which the public really don't get this. And so increasingly we are distant from nature. Our food comes out of plastic bags, we go to work in an air-conditioned car, we go to a gymnasium, and we very rarely come across anything which is a living system, and certainly not in a way which connects to most people at a visceral emotional level. And so we're utterly disconnected. The exception to that is the indigenous societies who still bring that philosophical, nature-centric worldview, which is why it's so critical that they've been involved in these negotiations, because there is real hope. So those barriers, they're deep and they're big and they're real, and we mustn't try to get past these by going straight to an international treaty and trying to write down some more targets and words, because it simply won't work. And then on top of all of that is the economic system. The way we judge value and progress has got nothing to do with nature. We are judging our progress in terms of how much stuff we're using up is what it comes down to in terms of what GDP actually is. And so we are measuring the wrong judgments of progress to reach completely the wrong conclusions. And when you do start to do some ecological economics and start to work out the contribution of nature-based solutions, if we call it that, and there's a famous paper from Robert Costanza published in Nature 2014, they quantify the contribution of so-called ecosystem services, $125 trillion per year. Nutrient recycling, carbon capture, public health, food, water, you name it. And that year, global GDP, $75 trillion. So the bit of the economy, which actually underpins the rest of it, nature, is worth far more than the bit we're measuring, the GDP, and yet in order to grow the GDP, we're destroying nature. This is the economics of the madhouse. And it is dependent upon those other four layers I just described. And so if we want to get to nature-based solutions, we have to smash through all of that and create a different narrative based upon a different conversation. Because trying to bring a few extra words into a treaty process that basically is going to be implemented against a backdrop of ecological illiteracy, ecological disconnectedness, and a mad economic system, I'm afraid we're not going to succeed.
Thank you.
That's probably the end of my career as a government servant.
Let's see if we can follow. Let's see where we go from there. Let's try and move this towards solutions. I think what you said struck in me there. When I was following the loss and damage discussions, I was always struck by the fact that in the UN, biodiversity is counted under what is classified as non-economic losses. Within UN
non-economic losses, there we are.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So
I'm going to write that down.
So within the UN language around loss and damage, you'd have conversations around, yes, agriculture, yes, industry, but you'd also have, and there's everything under non-economic losses, which is not only the entirety of biodiversity, but also the entirety of human culture and everything else in between. So I think you're right. I think there is a real disconnect, and that's why I'm really pleased that we've got folks from Youth for Nature and Younger here who are able to speak to that, but also the fact that we're within this multilateral system. So how do we work within it in a way that works, and while remembering that 80% of global biodiversity is protected on indigenous territories, who make up less than 5% of world populations. So we have a huge amount, and those groups are not represented in this space. But let's bring it back to the panel. Do people want to respond to Tony or respond to that initial question of what the core barriers are? Maybe Nathalie and then Abraham. Nathalie, kick us off.
Well, just to sort of add on to what Tony said about the economic system, I've sort of started thinking about it in the fact that we currently have an economic system that is unraveling the web of life. We need an economic system that is in service of the web of life. And we need to transition we need to make the current system as good as it possibly can be, making the science as good as it possibly can be, making the markets work for nature as best as they possibly can. But it ultimately is tinkering with the system, that has caused the damage in the first place. It's only ever going to get so far. It's very constrained. But there are lots of brilliant things happening in this as we transition from an economy that's unraveling life to an economy that's in service of life. And I think maybe we, in this discussion, getting, because there's a lot of brilliant things happening around repurposing subsidies. So long, we can invest in nature-based solutions, but so long as we're continuing to pour fuel on the flames, that is just papering over cracks. House is on fire and, we're papering over the cracks. But so getting to sort of grips with it, the whole subsidies thing, which is why, some language in these international processes about, people say, where the finance going to come from? Well, we subsidise the destruction of the biosphere to the tune of $1 trillion a year. Taxpayers' money, our money, is going to, so that needs fixing, is a massively important one. But then one of the sort of, say, maybe bringing it down a layer, and the other mechanism is, and nature-based thinking, what I was saying about landscapes, is you need so many different actors, so many different stakeholders, so many different ministries need to be working together in order for a nature-based solution in a landscape to work. So the whole structure of siloed science and siloed governance is hugely problematic. But there are different countries in the world that have got cross-ministerial working groups that are trying to tackle this and make sure the Treasury's talking to the Department of Agriculture, is talking to Forestry, that's talking to Education, that's talking to Transport. There are places in countries where those conversations are happening and some quite visionary things are going. And I'd say that that's in the transition pathway to this new economy. So we can point to those good examples. And the same with sort of in science, this need for interdisciplinary working is massively important. And there are some brilliant things going on in various institutions where we are finally getting mathematicians to talk to economists, to talk to ecologists, and ecologists are in the mix and all over the place now, which is great. They're still not running countries, which is a problem, or we would think so. But at least I would say there's some great examples of where those kind of barriers to scaling are actually being overcome with some progressive thinking on it. So I'll leave it there.
That's good, because we're going to come back to policy later in the discussion. I'm going to go to Abraham, then Olson, then Alex.
Okay, thank you so much. I've been thinking since I raised my hand up how to put this so you don't put me on your blacklist of invitation next time. But almost everyone has hinted at the fact that nature-based solutions are not new. It's a new term, but the entire thing is not new. And one of the big barriers is that it's being approached from a top-down. It's a top-down sort of approach in terms of the discussion on nature-based solutions, not the concept itself, but the whole discussion that we are having in the international space and the policy, environmental policy space is being done top-down. And the reason why I'm scared you might not invite me again is because it's almost evident that this is coming from, it's a Eurocentric, term. I mean, Europe started wanting to connect back to nature, seeing the benefits of, going back to nature. But for a lot of communities in Africa, in South America, they are already with nature. They have been living with nature. So if you go back to them talking about, oh, we have this brilliant solution, which is nature-based solutions, it's ridiculous to them because we have been using these solutions. And so we have to really think really well about it. And it's nice for those of us who have passports to be able to fly, come and sit on these decks and chat about this. But then it's really important that if in the implementation of nature-based solutions, it's a more transdisciplinary approach and making sure that local people, we've said that indigenous people, local people are engaged in the entire process. And I remember I was part of a consulting team working with Luke Hoffman. I think they've changed their name now. It was under WWF, and it was on the narratives on nature-based solutions. And one indigenous person said, if someone comes to build a dam in my community, I know that they've just come to build something and go. If someone comes to my community to take my land for a project and don't consult me, that is a problem. Because you are taking away what is their identity, their land. So I think these are like really practical things that we need to think about and make sure that we bring everyone on the table when we are talking about nature-based solutions. So yeah, that is all I'll just add quickly.
Okay, I just want to add to what Abraham said, and I think We've also seen these misaligned priorities across the discussion of nature-based solutions. We know that the interest of probably the private sector who have access to this kind of space where we are, looking into profits. We know some other people are looking. So, and then why the priorities of indigenous and local communities is their environment, is their people, the planet. But then we have so many misaligned priorities that go on in the decision of nature-based solutions. And I feel like a lot of implementation of nature-based solutions are also going with that line of narrative of like what is actually being financed. And when you look at the kind of solutions that are being financed, because of course private sector holds a lot of money and they could move things forward, but then you can say that these kind of solutions that are being financed are also following this narrative, which is not centering around people and planet, but just what we can use nature to trap all the carbons in the air. And this is not what nature-based solution means to a lot of communities, especially people that really care about the environment. You know, it means so much to them. So I think in going forward, we need to find a way on how can we align these priorities around the priorities of local communities and, you know, indigenous people that centers around people and nature, because behind nature-based solution, there are real people that are really taking this on. Okay. Alex?
Difficult to add anything really clever after all the perfect contributions from here, but two things I'd like to make. 2 points. One around finances, that I think there's been a lot of pledges and a lot of governments bragging about how much they're putting money into this, but I think the first thing is that it's not enough. I've done my back of the envelope maths myself, and I've seen that it's something like many thousands of times less than what is needed. The gap, the financial gap, is not enough. And the second point about finance is that it's not always reaching the right hands. I know of so many projects of brilliant people, really committed, but for instance, we're talking about Kenya. I've been trying to help people at the Mabinju powerhouse, and they're doing restoration with a lot of local, the youth communities, and they're really struggling to get funds to a water pump so they can water their seedlings for, just growing the trees. So some really simple, small amounts, and there are no mechanisms. I know that from Brazil and from many places that people are not getting access to the funds that are being pledged. It's really complicated, and they don't know where to go. Perhaps biodiversity and carbon credits might help in the future, but it's still a lot of hurdles on the way. So we need to go directly from those pledges to the people who are going to implement that on the ground. And my second point is about, this paradox, which you already alluded to, or conflict. On one hand, we want to move at pace and at scale, because it's a crisis, really, right? The climate, and we need it now. On the other hand, it's about how to make it inclusive and just. And I think there's a lot of brilliant ideas, but they have not really been scaled up to the level that is needed. And how to, get scalable solutions, I think is a big challenge. For instance, we are helping DEFRA now with this Global Center on Biodiversity for Climate, which really aims at identifying ideas which can be scaled up and implemented across a vast area. But it's challenging, and it's something that really takes time to develop, and scientists, we want to be perfect, we want to provide solutions which are going to be bulletproof, but I think we have to accept that sometimes we need to oversimplify and learn as we go.
I'd like to think a little bit about, because I think it's important when we're thinking about nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based approaches, that we think about what are the benefits that it's bringing to people. Because I think sometimes, especially in these grand United Nations spaces, that's not made clear. So I'd like to put that to the group, maybe starting with Nathalie and moving to you, Tony, on what do you think are the key benefits for why this should be a major policy priority? I know the list is endless, so try to keep it brief. And then and after that question, we're gonna move on to a little bit about how we make sure that we do those implementations correctly. So, yeah.
I mean, where to begin? I mean, we are nature, the language is all around nature in service of people, but we're all connected in a web of life, and the natural ecosystems and ecological processes are our life support system. So the list is endless. I mean, my own interest in nature-based solutions actually really came in the adaptation space, and I would say when it comes to the science and the evidence from traditional wisdom accumulated over millennia, referring to your point about how people, especially all over the world, have been working with nature, but the benefits it brings in terms of enabling us to deal with all the change that we're experiencing, all the variability that's coming with climate change and all the other things that we're doing to the biosphere, Earth system processes. So protecting us from climate impacts, massively important, which is why, you know, many have been fighting today to really try and get nature in the adaptation agenda, because we can't adapt to the impacts of climate change unless we work with nature as part of nature, whether that's defending ourselves against, you know, coastal erosion, landslides, droughts, fire, you know, heat waves in cities. The benefits of nature in cities are endless. So there's all of that, but then linked to that, there's all the health and well-being benefits, an enormous value of bringing nature into cities for mental health, especially for young people. And then all the economic benefits. We recently did an analysis looking at the economic recovery potential of investing in sustainable community-led restoration of our ecosystems on land and in the sea, and the value in terms of economic recovery are huge, in that all the post-pandemic economic recovery packages of the world's countries didn't include, you know, investing in restoring our badly damaged landscape. So there are economic benefits, there are health benefits, there are adaptation benefits, and then eventually, you know, and in certain circumstances there are benefits too for carbon. But the carbon is the co-benefit. We need to focus on the core benefits, which are the things I've just mentioned. So that, you know, it's important to get to net zero, and we do need to, you know, reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and there are lots and lots of important ways of doing that. But you know, Earth will not be habitable. A cooler Earth will not be habitable unless we also address the challenges we are discussing today. So, yeah.
Tony, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so following that, so I think one of the key questions is who is getting what benefit, right? And so at the moment, quite a lot of the benefits that flow from decisions that societies make, including in the climate space, a lot of those benefits are measured in financial return, and the biggest actors who very often are accruing those benefits are private sector interests of different kinds. So when you look at the whole climate change space, I think it is quite striking how the things that have grown, the things that have got momentum, are things which you can make and which you can sell and which bring you a profit. Hence, electric vehicles, nuclear power stations, wind turbines, solar panels, and to an extent, carbon credit forestry. These are all things that give you a pretty clear return quite quickly, or on an investment cycle. You can put your money in and you get some money back, and it comes to a particular interest. Whereas a lot of what we're talking about today, what you're saying, you know, the web of life, this irreplaceable, beautiful thing which has evolved over billions of years, protecting and restoring that, it brings enormous benefits, but they don't fall to any particular entity that is active in the process of generating a return on investment. And so it fails to get the support it needs for those benefits to flow for the collective. And so how do you fix that gap? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about this and writing about this a lot, and then became very interested in the whole idea of ecosystem services and valuing those, and then connecting ecosystem services to ecosystem markets. And we're doing some good work on that in England. We have a biodiversity net gain market going to be linked to development coming in next year. We've got a nutrient mitigation market which encourages people to create wetlands, and they get paid for that by developers who are going to put more nutrients into the system. There are massive limitations with that stuff, and there are big dangers with it, but I think at least you can start to answer the question of how you can get those benefits to be seen as more visible, they've got some value, and then people start to invest in them. Because for me, it's no longer a question of saying, like, you know, what are the benefits of public health? They are massive, irreplaceable. What are the benefits for water security? Well, civilization will stop if fresh water stops being recycled, and it's not being recycled by water utilities, it's being recycled by oceanic plankton and rainforests and soils. That's where the real work is being done. But we don't capture it, it's not valued anywhere. So closing that gap and being able to enable people to invest in nature and see some benefit, that for me is a really, really key question. I mean, the other end of this is kind of some of the points that were made about people living close to nature. They don't need to be told about the economic benefits, do they? They kind of live it every day. Yeah. This is a Western mindset I'm describing, because in our societies, we've lost that connection. We just don't see it anymore. And as a result, all of these failures go unnoticed. And so being able to close that gap so that the collective benefit can be understood by people making decisions, that's what I think it comes down to. But I don't think it's to do with shortage of data or an understanding of these things, and environmental economists, they've quantified it, but it goes just so far then it stops. because that next step that's needed to invest in nature's recovery, people just can't see the benefit coming to them. And so how we fix that? Big picture economics, subsidy reform actually is another one. You could start to create different incentives. $1 trillion worth of subsidy, you know, we could use that, and that would start to create a different incentive. Of course, don't forget that people have over decades been building up industries which actually rely on those subsidies and they benefit from them. Pesticides, fertilizers, machinery, you know, all of these things that are destroying biodiversity, they do very well off of subsidies. And so there's not necessarily a straightforward thing to say, let's switch them to nature recovery. Similarly with fossil fuels, an interesting subject on the agenda here. Anyway, I could go on. I won't.
Oluwaseun, in your opening statement, you said that we're showing up for nature because nature's a means of survival. And in my initial question, I asked, what are the co-benefits of nature? And the answer is obviously survival. But I just wondered, from your perspective and what you're seeing when you're implementing your work on the ground, what are you seeing there around how nature-based solutions, even though they are the oldest thing, this reinvention of them, how are you seeing people respond to them? How are you seeing the benefits manifest? Yeah, just love your thoughts on that.
Oh my God, I can go on and on about this. Yeah, because you've said it right, that this is not a new thing that has been happening. One of the first things we actually saw were like, there's so many grassroots organizations, but also local communities that are already, you know, restoring their degraded forest without any assistance, without any finance, because they can't even access these finances. And I think it also comes from the discussion that you were talking about, this connection between even learning about the benefits of nature should be consulting the people who have lived longest with this nature, you know, who have it as part of their life. But I think many of the time we come as experts to these people, and then we take this position of like expert that creates a lot of top-down power dynamics that are not really relatable, right, to the local communities. And they see us and they be like, okay, yeah, I remember I did one project and I had to consult with local communities, and we were talking, and at that point I noticed that I was talking and they weren't responding, you know, like they were just listening to me. And by the time I'm like, okay, please, I want to hear from you, what do you have? And then they started, nobody was able to stop. They talked to me a lot from their heart, and I think we don't have that connection because we come here as experts. Meanwhile, the people that should be consulted at back home, they are back in their local communities. And most of the time, even people that are representing us in national levels, they don't really do this consultation before coming to discuss about what they have nothing to say about, basically. And so there's that disconnection. And one thing that our project in Uka showed us is that every nature-based solution, every benefit from nature are best understood by people that are living in these communities that are interacting on a daily basis with these ecosystems, right? And then all of the solutions that are that manifested from that project were based on what the young people, these grassroots organizations said they want. They want to restore their, and they told us, we want to restore our degraded forest. We know all of the species that we've lost in these ecosystems, in these wetlands, and we want to bring them back. And that is how they started. And now they have seed banks, you know, through the program, because we also gave micro-granting. We are a youth-led organization, but at least we were able to source for something to give to these very local youths who were unable to brand themselves and come to a space like this to even advocate for funding. Like you've mentioned, I feel like many of the designing and implementation of nature-based solutions are not even coming from the right people, right? They are coming from the people who wants to greenwash, and then, you know, and they have the money to move things. And so who are the people implementing, who are the people designing these projects? Who are the people with the interest, and who are the people financing it? And, you know, what are the proper safeguards and mechanisms that we are putting in place? Sometimes I was asking myself, do we need a nature-based solution committee that will just help us to facilitate and make sure that, you know, enough of the greenwashing and all of these things that are happening, that we just make sure that we are approaching this in the right way, just like we are setting it up for loss and damage now. And everyone is advocating for structural mechanism, transparent and accountability framework, because that is the way everything that comes up of this space that doesn't have this very structural backing ends up. So from our own projects, you know, we've seen young people with their local organization create seed bank to restore like the ecosystem that has been lost. They are bring back the tree species that they've lost in their ecosystem that were there originally. And then we've also seen the wetlands. We have this big ship that we work with, and they are restoring their wetlands. And now they use it as a tourist attraction to say, come and see what we are trying to restore. We are trying to restore this, our degraded ecosystem. So it is a means of livelihood to these people. It's also a means of connection. They want to bring back everything they've lost years ago. And this, I think, is a benefit that non-economic system can actually quantify, because it means so much to the people that matters.
It's interesting. I think the topic of free, prior, and informed consent is amazingly, and we're really thrilled, becoming more and more apparent. But historically, it's been used in things like infrastructure development.
Yeah.
But what you're saying and what we're hearing around many, many other conversations around MBS and ecosystem-based approaches is that free, prior, and informed consent obviously needs to be everywhere across everything from infrastructure through to MBS development. And that in your experience, and please correct me if I'm making the wrong assumption here, that you think that you're finding that when the communities are building things as at the table, that it's more successful.
Yes.
Yeah. And like that is, and you talk to everyone and they're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
So how are we building the structures to support that? And I want to pin that because I'd like to come back to it. Because I want us to think in the second half of this conversation about solutions. Because MBS is one of those topics where it's really easy to talk about the problems, because there are lots of them, around what, the pitfalls, greenwashing has come up repeatedly, and I'd love to get you guys' thoughts on how do we tackle that. But let's get some final thoughts on this initial round of questioning, and then we'll move towards solutions, if that's all right. So, Alex, Abraham, anything you wanted to add?
I guess probably I could add a little bit on, I'd always been, like she mentioned, we have to be careful on how we bring in the private sector, but the private sector is really important, because if you look at a lot of the people that are degrading our lands, it's the private sector. So if you're looking at those who are degrading the lands and you do not bring them onto the table, that is also concerning. But we also have to do it in a very safe way, that they do not take advantage of the discussion or the space to, implement false solutions, which is what we don't want. I guess yesterday I saw a report that came out. I think it's the State of Finance for Nature. I think it's always been developed by the UNEP. I think it came out yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. And what I saw in there was like $1.7 trillion investment, which is against nature from the private sector. From the private sector, and then 1.7 trillion from government, and then 5 trillion from the public sector. This is how much investments are going in, which is against nature.
Yeah.
And this is serious. If we are having private sector spend about 5 trillion against nature, and governments actually projects going about 1.7 trillion, which is also against nature, then it means that we've not brought them onto the discussion of them seeing why it's beneficial for them to invest in nature. And I feel that you've talked about the economics and all that. How do we make this more practical? COP26, I think, was the one I had all the biggest billions of dollars being announced in terms of adaptation finance. And every country was announcing after. It seemed like it was a competition at a point. And now we do not see how the money translates onto the local people, the young people who are doing real projects, Youth for Nature, who are doing real projects on the ground. How do we trickle down these investments to make sure that it's going right into nature? I've worked with youth organizations that run on $500 budget, and they're doing amazing projects in Africa. If they had just a little bit more, they could do even more than what they are currently doing. And this is what we need to talk about, not just this country is giving 10 billion for adaptation or for nature. How does it trickle down? How do we make sure that governments are receiving this money is going down, and private sector is also making sure that these monies that they are promising are actually reaching the organizations and the local communities on the ground that are actually implementing the nature-based solutions. So I think the benefits will be seen when we channel investments to the right people who are actually implementing, rather than giving it to big corporations, big organizations that are already known to be in the nature space, to be the front line and the headband or the banners of nature-based solutions. It's good that we talk about this, but it is really important that we fight for finance to be trickled down to the key people. Thank you.
It's really interesting because this morning Nathalie and I were working on the new text for the Global Goal of Adaptation came out, and in it is a lot of the conversation and difficulty in the negotiations is around money. And the current language on adaptation financing is the doubling of adaptation financing. And to that I have two questions. Firstly, the doubling of zero is still zero. And at the moment, adaptation financing is so small that it feels like it's akin to zero. And secondly, adaptation financing for what? And I think this reflects perfectly what you were just saying. It's like, trickle down, yes, but we don't just want trickle down. Like, we know it's working most effectively when it's at the local level. So how are we doing direct financing? And I'm looking at that text, and we're working our hardest to try and strengthen it, but at the same time, you're seeing it, and like, this feels like I'm seeing the conservation that ZSL is doing on the ground that we're seeing reflected in this whole conversation, and it's like, the money's going in the wrong direction. It feels like it's going in the wrong direction. So it's so interesting to hear about this topic of direct financing, because it comes up again and again and again. And I want to we've got about 10 minutes more of sort of some thoughts on the panel, and then we're going to open up for conversation from the audience. But I want us to think about policy. We are in a policy arena. And Tony, maybe I'll pick on you, and any others who want to come in on what do you think are the key policy and legislative levers and mechanisms that we need to be pulling and trying to influence to not only scale MBS, but to scale financing towards adaptation that is designed and created at the local level and isn't enforced top down?
So I'll just give you a few headings just to get the conversation going. So one thing that I think would help enormously would be to replace our economic indicator. And a lot of people have spent a lot of time working on this, some very clever people over many years. One of the better ideas that I've seen is the idea of the genuine progress indicator. And so what this would do would give you a rounded view, not only of economic growth in a traditional sense, but also add into that the environmental footprint of societies, the well-being of people, and also levels of equality. So all of these things are related, and we can increasingly measure them all. So putting them into a indicator that can give us a more rounded view, I think would help change the context for all of the discussions that follow. So that's a huge, big thing, but actually it would unlock so much downstream consequence in a positive way that I think it's worth mentioning. So switching subsidies, we mentioned that. That's obvious. It's a no-brainer. People have been doing it talking about it for years. We're actually doing some of that in England at the moment on agricultural subsidies. We're switching away from area payments, and we're inviting farmers to participate in programs which will be beneficial for nature and the environment, and to be paid for doing that work instead of just growing food without any reference to environmental goals. So that's quite challenging, but it's coming. But it is an example of subsidy switching. I think another thing that would help is to have official standards within countries, ideally between countries, whereby if you're going to do a nature-based solution, it would meet 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever they are, standards, which would set out the ways in which you avoid greenwash. So if you want to have an officially recognised nature-based solution, you have to meet these standards. And then in order to be able to connect with the grassroots, I think we need a bottom-up process alongside the top-down ones. So if we started switching funding, so subsidies and private sector investment, into nature-based solutions, then finding a way of that meeting a grassroots agenda which is being determined by the people who live in those geographies is pretty critical. And actually, again, we actually got a good scheme going in England at the moment called Local Nature Recovery Strategies, which is basically a spatial planning exercise which will involve local communities in working out where to put the trees, where to put the wetlands, where to put the floodplain recovery, where to do the reintroductions of rare and missing species. And that is a process that's driven by the people who live there. And what you can do with that, once you create the spatial plan, is then you can implement the plan with that money that's coming from the top down. And so it's a way of like bottom up and top down meeting each other. And so we're working on that, and it's a way of combining different budgets coming from different places. So that's another thought. And then I'll just give you one more other thought, which is a big one again, but I think it's quite an important one to register, is that we have ecology as a compulsory school subject from day one to the end when you leave, so that people have got just some basic ecological training. I mean, you kind of go through life, you know, mathematics, science, you know, languages, these things are compulsory. I mean, if human civilization is going to survive, we have to have an ecological training that's also compulsory. And the good thing about that, actually, it would be enjoyable, unlike mathematics, in my opinion.
Would anyone else like to come in on the policy question? Alec, anyone? Otherwise, we'll move to questions from the
I
audience.
can say something that is
Yeah,
very
please.
related to
And
that.
then
Thank you so much. I think you actually touched on everything we said. I think there's also this important aspect of scaling up already solutions that are existing within communities instead of coming up with different new approach and different new solutions. Like I said, if we learn from, I mean, you can also learn from Inuka. We have so many learnings that we can share. But like scaling up solutions, there are solutions that are already existing within communities that are not being amplified or not being talked about in places like this. And all they need is just that push of that scale up of that funding that would help them to, you know, like make these solutions big. We don't have to design a new solution or design a new project to get funding. What are the things that communities are already doing to recover their biodiversity, to recover their degraded landscape? And then let's support them to scale up those things, you know, because these solutions are existing, like I said. And also in the areas of finances, you know, even as youth-led organization, many of the finances that comes to us are always very restricted and very unaccessible. So you have this long list of proposal to write and what you want to see in the proposal. And you know, in making all of this restricted funding, is already restricted the action and taking ownership and initiative away from local communities that are implementing this project. So it's like you can do A, B, C, D with the funds that are available. And so this push away from that ownership allow local communities to have access to unrestricted and, you know, accessible funding that they can easily access, because it's like, you know, you have solutions within your communities. For instance, the local communities we are working with, and then we had to like have discussion on how to write proposals, fundraising proposals with them. And then one of the constant challenges that they said is that they've been doing this work on funded, volunteer basis within their local communities because it matters to them, but because they cannot, every funding there for nature-based solutions are always very restricted, and then they have this criteria that non-grassroots organization can actually meet up to, you know. You have to have a budget of $1 million USD, you have to have this in order to access this kind of funding. So who are we giving this funding to, and who are we enabling with this kind of finance system? So I think we need to honestly put a very accessible financial systems if we want to, like you said, so many finances are going against nature, and I think we need to put our money for nature. Thank you.
Alex, did you want to come?
Yeah, I think the point that Oliver is making is really painful to hear, and that's very much our shared experience as well, that some really fantastic grassroots movements are not being funded or not being seen because we have this top-down approach. And I don't think actually that any companies or governments are really altruistic. And back to the point about who's driving those agendas, I think to me personally, this is very much a question about justice and about the systemic, you know, inequalities that exist in our planet. And I think that wealthy countries have a moral duty to pay back and to repair some of the damage that has been caused. And there are some good examples. So I want to go into some of the positive, you know, things we could showcase. And for instance, at Q, we've been working in Madagascar since the 1980s. And Madagascar is the poorest country that is not at war at the moment. And we have about 60 members of staff, all Malagasy. It's a fantastic hotspot of biodiversity with species you won't find anywhere else, and which are playing fantastic, very important roles in ecosystems, including you know, storing carbon, but much more than that. It's about all the other benefits. On the other hand, there's very, very little left of it. So what we're doing now, thanks to grant from DEFRA, which is the UK government's support, and with many partners, is to support the grassroots movements about restoring some of those habitats. And back to the nature-based initiatives which really work, we think that there's a fantastic opportunity now in terms of really practical things of generating jobs and engaging with the communities. People working on restoration around conserved areas, protected areas, where most of the species are, so that you reduce the pressure within the protected areas. Because people need to cook, they need to warm up their house. You can't just tell them to stop doing that. They really need alternatives rather than being hampered from doing their day-to-day practice. So I think there's some really good opportunity with nature-based solutions in terms of bringing some of those long-term benefits to the communities that we're seeing here. We also have a much stronger ownership for those restored habitats, our nature-based solutions, in the longer term, because people are going to keep them for ecotourism and for the resources of charcoal and other products they get out of forests. So I think there's some really good opportunities, and those are examples which will benefit biodiversity, because it increases the protection of the rare populations of threatened species, but also the livelihoods of the people, because it generates income, and also the carbon benefits. So I think there are win-wins, and I think we need to do much more in terms of sharing good experiences and transferring knowledge and learning from the local communities who know the best for their land and their species and those ecosystems. So I think we need to meet at the same level and have people representing different parts of this challenge around the table from the start.
Amazing, thank you. I think that's a perfect moment to move into Q&A. Lots of hands, that's great. I think we've got a roaming mic, is that right? Amazing, thank you. Oh gosh, there's a lot of you. You were the most enthusiastic, so I'll go for you first. It's just coming, one moment.
Mike is coming.
Pardon? Yes. And please introduce yourself and your organisation. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is David. I'm with the American Chemical Society. And I have a question for everybody, but it was inspired by Dr. Juniper, your thoughts on how do we get our decision makers to invest in our bottom-up approaches to nature-based solutions. And I disagree that there's a lack of data and education within our decision makers. I think that there's a lack of will to act. So how can I, as a private citizen and as a young scientist, apply this pressure effectively here at COPPA and in general?
Thank you.
Okay.
Tony, do you want to give that a stab?
Yeah, so in the political realm, the policies that are being designed by governments, either collectively like here or individually, there's a lot of things that are shaping the conversation, and so we would hope that quite a lot of it is to do with science and an understanding of, quite a lot of good information about the peril we face by not acting. That is undoubtedly one factor, but of course, as we've discussed here and I've mentioned already, there are interests in society who would like to present a slightly different view of what the science says. And so the discussion here about fossil fuels, it strikes me as being pretty straightforward, that if we want to have a 1.5 degree pathway, we have to phase out fossil fuels. That's my reading of the science, and I think it's pretty straightforward. There are other people who think it's more complicated and would have us believe that we need to carry on not only burning what we've got, but looking for more. Some countries are looking for more. And so that kind of gives you a sense of there being some interests beyond the science which are shaping the agenda. Against that, what else do we have? So probably the biggest thing to counter some of the ways in which you might read the science to reflect a particular point of view is public opinion, right? And so that's where you as a private citizen become very powerful, I would say, being a voter, being a consumer, being a leader, and in all three of those respects, you command a lot of power. And so, I think quite a lot of people, they get kind of hung up with elections, and that's, that is important, how we vote and who finishes up as president or prime minister. That determines a particular kind of track of thinking. But actually it's between the elections where we have enormous power in engaging with elected representatives and being able to say, actually, we think it's a really, really good idea to recover nature and go low carbon, and to continue with that discussion between elections. And everyone can do that. In a democracy they can anyway, and actually even not in a democracy. And everyone's got some power with that. Humans are extremely social animals, and so one thing we all underestimate is what people are taking from each of us as we do things and how we live our lives. And if people see other people leading an extremely fulfilling, wonderful, happy life, by being low consumers, leading a low consumption lifestyle, that's going to be more convincing to them than someone telling them that they're bad for having a big car. And so, you know, you've got a lot of power in a kind of soft way, and you almost don't notice it. It's culture. It's like the water that fish swim in. It's like human culture. We kind of don't notice it, but it determines everything. And people, as individuals, have an enormous power on that. And then there's, of course, the vested interests, who actually we all deal with. We buy power, we buy vehicles, we buy plane tickets, we buy food, we buy water in some countries. We've got a private water company set up. And all of those rely on consumers. And so do we as consumers tell our people we choose to bank with or shop with, do we tell them that we want you to be zero carbon, not a bit reduced carbon, zero carbon? And we'd like you to have a nature positive strategy. Otherwise I'm going to move my bank account to a different bank. And so all of these things are in the gift of all of us. If you want to be active, there's no shortage of things to do. And, you know, maybe coming to one of these probably is quite low down the list. But anyway, we're all here now. So,
Thank you, Tony. More questions, please. I'd like a question from a woman, please. With the scarf. Yes, thank you. Sorry, can we use the microphone just for the folks online? Thank you so much. And your name and organisation, please. Thank
Fantastic. My name's Amy Munro4. I work at Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge. It's building on a really similar theme. I love the commentary around the need for everyone to be learning ecology, but I think there's a piece about that which is really about an emotional piece and a cultural piece about the future decency of life. So there's what we can do with young people now to build their relationships with nature. There's definitely a Western perspective on that that's, I think, in some ways really, really urgent. But I've also got a question which is very much building on the previous question, which is if we've got private sector leaders and we've got governmental leaders, how do we build that emotional piece to convince those individuals that they need to understand that we are an explicit part of nature, and that ignoring that is going to not just affect everyone's lives, but their lives explicitly and their children's lives explicitly, and the role that that can have in building investment into nature.
And maybe Nat and then Alorton? Yeah.
I think this is where the humanities are really important. This is where art and music and love are important things here. And I think there's a big movement now about reconnecting decision makers with their spirituality and with their connection with nature. Most people love nature, whether it's an interaction through their pet or their garden, or you know, or whether they're because they happen to have been in a rainforest, if they have such fortune. But I had the great privilege of being involved in the UK's first People's Assembly for Nature, and involved the organisation that facilitated that. And the amount of emotion that there was in that compared to the one on climate, for example. The one on climate was fantastic, but it had a very different emotional tone. And I think we need to work with that, and we need to look to guidance from communities around the world that still have that explicitly and proudly. And so that's why hearing the Indigenous voice, at whom, you know, many Indigenous communities, the core of their spirituality is all about this, is all about that powerful emotional and spiritual connection. And there are many things that we can use, and I think art and humanities play an important role, and there's actually lots of great work going on in this space at the moment. One thing I wanted to say, sort of talking to my anthropologist friends who have a sort of more long-term historical perspective on human cultures, there's nothing inevitable about capitalism and the situation we find ourselves in. And in fact, human societies all over the world over time have actually lived much more in harmony with nature, and there are ways that we can get back to that in a space that we would all undoubtedly be much happier.
Thank you. I think I just dwell more a little bit on that. And I don't think leaders and private sector don't really know. They know and they can feel it, but it's also about priorities, like we've said, about where are their priorities. But I also think as a society, it also depends on what we value and what we place values on. Because when you look at, for instance, the issue between the global south and global north, what are the values that are existing in terms of, like, okay, for instance, many countries that actually have this connection to nature that we are talking about are always tell, oh, they are very poor countries, and that really creates a lot of narratives on what we celebrate and what we don't celebrate within our midst. And many of these countries now, we are trying to develop, right, to be like the developed nation, which is also going to bring a lot of impact. So I think as a society, we need to start on what we truly value, how we see, all this living with harmony with nature. How do we see countries that are actually living in harmony with nature? Like, what are we really putting our values on? What are we celebrating in the society? I think that will go a long way.
That's okay.
I just want to say, I think that many of us here sitting here today, we are here because we think it's meaningful, and flying all the way to Dubai, it's not something that I was really looking forward, but actually just in the meeting with people and the passion that many of us share for doing something concrete for our planet is something that really motivates me and gives me hope. So I think I just want to stress the importance of experience and taking kids especially to nature, because so many people are now growing up in cities and they have no idea about what a natural ecosystem looks like, and those interactions. I think I look back into my childhood in Brazil's Atlantic forest and just being absolutely perplexed by the amazing beauty of nature. So I think that if you think about CEOs or how we can convince them, it might not be that easy because it's just information, but we have to think that CEOs have also been children in the past, and today's children and youth are the future leaders of our planet, and hopefully if we invest in them now, despite the fact I'm a busy person, I never say no to actually interact with teenagers and children who are just amused by what's in it for them in nature, and getting that experience across is something that really can change their lives, I think, for the future.
I think I'll just add a little bit of my thoughts to that, because it's such a good question. I think part of it is around, we need to have a discussion around what is right and what is easy. And in Naturebased Solutions, we are seeing a manifestation of doing what's easy, which is monoculture planting, being called nature-based solutions when there's no life in it, there's no thriving abundance, there's no biodiversity. And when we're doing the storytelling piece, which I think gets undermined in spaces like this, we need to be telling that story about how what we're striving for is biodiverse, thriving, abundant landscapes. And within that, there's a space for CEOs who wouldn't be CEOs if they didn't have some desire to be doing something important. They can be in a position of courage and of leadership. And I think there's a really important story to tell there between the science, between the policy, between business, of there is courage in diversity of life and in this. I just think that's such an important point, and I loved what the previous panelists have said. So we've got time for probably 3 more questions if people are quick. Right. Oh gosh, there's too many choices. Microphone, lady, please, and then you, and then you.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Alexa. I've studied environmental policy, environmental economics, and ecology. And first of all, I wanted to, and I'm still a student, so I'm still learning. First of all, I wanted to thank you all for this really, really refreshing, honest panel. I think I didn't hear many of these very open panels in the last few days, which was a bit frustrating. I just wanted to thank you for this. Not being afraid to sit on any blacklist, please. Yeah, and I, having studied ecology and economics, I would like to direct a question to Tony, to Dr. Juniper, because you were calling our economic system the economics of the madness, and that we need to create a different narrative. And I always find myself at this delicate balance between we need to be fast, but also we need to change the methods and tools that we use. And here in many side events we hear about market-based mechanisms and pricing carbon, of course, and I totally see that we have to use methods that can operate within the current system, and even we were talking about language before, that are understood by current economists, current policymakers, the private sector. And yes, of course, please price negative externalities like carbon, finally. But then if we talk about positive externalities and pricing them, aren't we remaining within the same system that has just caused the problems that we are in? And is this really what we strive for? And if yes, how can we price it? And I mean, there's so many ways you can price this, and who decides then in the end? So, yeah, but if we say, what else can we do, then, well, this will need more time. So how do we solve this problem?
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Well, we wouldn't have started from here, right? So I was involved with panels that had a substantially similar conversation to this in 1991 in the preparatory meetings for the Rio Summit, where the first framework convention was put together. So we wouldn't begin right here, but we are beginning right here, and so time is more pressing than it should have been. But the answer to your question in terms of how we go forward, I think part of it was in the question, which is about what we're striving for, right? So I think one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves, which we very rarely ask, is what is the economy for? So if you look at the newspapers, you probably think the economy is for growing. We've got to grow the economy. Certainly in my country, the growth story is there day in, day out. Everyone's competing for policies to grow more quickly than someone else. The actual question is beyond that. And I think the answer, the way I would put the answer of what is the economy for, I would say the economy is for sustaining long and happy lives for everybody within environmental limits. Okay? Now, if you go down that road, you're kind of like, we want longevity, we want happiness, and we want the environmental footprint to be minimized to the point where everybody can live a good life, which implies equality as well, because we can't share out the environmental space as we are at the moment. I mean, you know, a citizen of this country compared to a citizen of Nigeria, you know, the environmental footprint is massively different. So if the economy is about long and happy lives for everybody, not just to some of the people, then it's got some major implications. So it's about the purpose of the economy is the first question. And if you say it's for that, then I'm very relaxed about the methods. I'm very happy for there to be market mechanisms, for there to be pricing signals, but they would need to be geared to that outcome. Are we actually improving conditions for people, and are we doing it in a way which is going to cut the carbon down to zero and going to restore nature at the same time? And then the toolkit is very variable. You know, we've said some of the things we've got. We've got subsidies, we've got markets, we've got standards for ecosystem markets. We could have good old regulation and ban certain things, you know, chemicals that are destroying biodiversity or things that are going to lead to the destruction of critical ecosystems. And so the policy mix is there if only we embrace that new goal. So, and that then comes back, it's a massive political question then. Are people going to vote for that vision and that kind of thought, or are they very happy with just voting for the person who's going to give them more growth of the old kind? And that's the key question.
It's risky, but thank you.
Yeah, well.
I'm going to go to the lady in the white jacket, and then you, sir, in the corner.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This has been a very inspiring panel. I'm Angela Burnett, Climate Change Officer in the Virgin Islands, Caribbean region. I agree with everything that you've outlined, sir, who just last spoke, in terms of the key challenges to nature-based solutions. I see them in my community every day. My question is a very pragmatic one, because the first point you raised is exactly right. If you bring a solution to a politician, let's do a seawall versus mangroves, they'll most likely choose the seawall, even though it's far more expensive, they don't have access readily to the capital to do it, etc., etc.
It won't work.
But I think we have to appreciate that our politicians are a reflection of the people. And
Exactly.
even if I were able to convince the politician that ultimately makes a decision that the mangrove solution is better, they still won't go for it because they know that the people will think it's nonsense. So we do have to do a better job of educating the people and convincing them first, because they're the avenue to convincing the politicians ultimately. And so my question is, as somebody who works in the space as an adaptation practitioner and has to make these arguments, I often find the challenge is that I can't readily find examples of where it has worked. So I can take to them concrete evidence, see, look, here they have done it in this community and it has worked well and it costs this much and it took that long for them to see the results. And so I think one of the things that's sorely lacking in our arena is some common depository of where we can find examples that have worked with all of the data, a data clearinghouse, warehouse for nature-based solutions where we can readily go to as practitioners, find the information that we need to build our case and populate it ourselves as we endeavor in an adventure of learning and failing and succeeding so that we can all learn from each other in this space. I'm curious to know if anything like this exists, if you can help point me to where I can find these resources, and if not, if somebody in this panel will take the lead to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Incredibly important. And I'm glad you also highlighted sharing from failure too, because failure is fine so long as we work out why it failed and we can then use it in adaptive management. There's lots of us working on this. So creating an interactive global map of good practice, nature-based solutions from around the world. We have one in Oxford that's got 150 case studies on there at the moment, but we're collaborating with, over the next year or so, collaborating with other organisations that have a wealth of knowledge from different case studies around the world, reaching out to local communities to making it possible for people to upload their own experiences onto that. So, various conservation organisations involved in that, but most important is to then reach out to the local communities, because everyone, if you talk in the investment community, they're like, oh, we need a pipeline of investable projects, and what does that look like? But actually more positive framing is about how do we connect all these incredible people, these incredible communities, so they can learn from one another. And in a warming world, that learning is going to be impossible, because what works now might not work in a few years' time in a hotter world, right? So yes, I can point you in the direction of existing platforms, but the idea is that we try and bring these all together so that, as you say, there's one place to go to. And that in terms of standards, the IUCN has developed its global standard for nature-based solutions through a 2 to 3 year consultation process, and there's lots of pilots of those at the moment. So there are really strong guidelines around high integrity, respecting local communities' knowledge, leadership, as well as ecological benefits and biodiversity benefits and so forth, and sorts of refining of that going on. So it's a really, really hot topic, really, really lots of action there. So hopefully, maybe in a year's time, you'll be more satisfied that there's a place to go to. But yeah, watch the space. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, sure. I would just want to add quickly. So yes, there are a lot, I think she mentioned, there are a lot of such documents. I think even recently the G20 DRR working group did a compendium of good best practices for nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction. So a lot of these, but I think one thing we have to do is move away from traditional compendiums, like these big books, and people don't actually even know where they are, read them, and it's boring. I think you mentioned about culture, about storytelling, about different ways of communicating, and I think that is one of the key things. We're talking about reaching out to the future generations, and I remember being at this science policy workshop, these guys doing amazing things, and like, how do we get to know? Is that, it's in our newsletter? I'm like, a lot of young people don't read newsletters these days, So how do we move, all these, amazing information from, traditional ways that, don't reach a lot of people to different platforms to reach a lot of people. And I think also we are giving governments a lot of credit in here as if they know what to do. I know a lot of government institutions that do not know how to even communicate between ministries. A lot of governments are very, very terrible even talking to each other. There are ministries in countries that do not know that this ministry is doing something on mangrove and another ministry is doing the same thing, and even some governments have 5 ministries. I'm not mentioning my country's name, but some governments have like 5 ministries, 10 ministries that are working on intersecting things. And these are some of the practical things that are happening. Maybe it's not the same for developed countries because you have all the data. Okay, thank you so much. But sometimes we give governments so much, we feel like, there's all the data, but then actually sometimes there's no data. A lot of people are not working in synergy. So if we want, you mentioned something that's really dear to my heart, making sure the various conventions work together, biodiversity, UNCCD, UNFCCC, but these, I had a session on this, purely on this, inviting all these guys. The conclusion was, we need the local governments, we need the ministries, we need the authorities, those who are working on the local level, to be able to work together, to be able to bring, things like nature-based solutions to the forefront, because otherwise we will be engaged in monoculture, false solutions that do not work together to promote biodiversity. So I'm just going to put it here.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry, sir. Come and find us at the end and ask your question. We have a very strict cutoff of 15:15, so I'm going to bring us to a close. Thank you so much to, firstly, our splendid panel. It's been wonderful to have you all here, and this has been a really fun conversation, so thank you. And also all of you. It's been really lovely to have you all here. I think I want to close us with the thought that we were opened with, which is that we're showing up for nature because it's a matter of survival. It's not a nice to have, it's an essential component of a thriving planet.
Yeah.
And yes, we are striving to keep 1.5 in reach. We need to decarbonize at an unprecedented rate. But we also want a planet that is livable and beautiful and thriving and full of life. And I think we need to bring that to the center of these conversations, in side events, in the negotiation rooms, and when we all go home. So with that, thank you all so much, and have a lovely evening.
Well done. Okay.